Welcome to Govware2022. API are fundamental to digital economy, servicing as a bridge to modernize legacy apps and cornerstone of modern digital experiences. APIs are also subject to the same attack that target web apps, namely exploits and abuse that lead to data breaches and fraud and introduce unintended risks from third-party integration and ecosystem. In this session, I'm going to demonstrate how you can discover and map APIs, block unwanted connections, and prevent data leakage. These capabilities will uplift your organization API strategy. A sample modern applications, Acadia Financials, will be used. Before that, let's understand and have a common understanding of some of the key truths about state of the API. API is on the rise and it will continue to gain momentum. This statement is being supported by multiple reputable published API reports. API is one of the core components of modern application. The role that it plays exemplified with the rise of microservices, cloud, distributed application, and modern application framework. As a result, developers are heavily reliant on API for integrations with third-party or internal application. The importance of API creates multitudes of challenges for organizations. One of those are API visibility and API governance. Due to the exponential growth of API usage, it is sort of out of control. As a result, organizations lost visibility on what and where or who own those API. Are those API properly secured? Are those API compliant to security policy? How often those API being used? And are there situations where those API are misused? Those are the common questions each organization should ask. Key truth number 2. Securing API is not a trivial task. Individual API endpoint could be the security weakest link. Are permissions properly defined so that it prevents one user from accessing another user's data? Data can be exfiltrated via those unauthenticated API. Developer potentially unintentionally expose sensitive dataset that may be leaked accidentally. As a result of the complexity of securing API, organizations typically face the challenges on talents or expertise to manage, operate, and secure those API. Key truth number 3. Organizations face the challenges of API documentation. Due to the pace of API growth, it overshadows the needs of a good and complete documentation practices. Developers often deploy public API, bypassing internally mandated security processes and procedure. Often than not, API are pushed to production without proper updated documentation. Here is the API architecture setup for Acadia Financial application. This application was deployed via a CI/CD pipeline demonstrated in Part 1. Please refer to Part 1 for the deployment of this modern application. Services are exposed via respective API gateway deployed on each site. Integrations between each microservices are via this API gateway. API gateway traffics are being monitored, analyzed, and protected by F5 Web Application and API Protection and API Discovery capabilities. This API Discovery and Abnormality Detections capabilities using advanced machine learning to characterize how consumer of API consume and what normal and abnormal traffic pattern to their API and latency experience. There are two groups of API traffic, North-South API or East-West API. North-South API being those API traffic from public to the application. This type of API can be an authenticated or an unauthenticated API. East-West API are API traffic flow between sites. This typically an internal or private API. For example, money transfer services calling backend service API. Let's proceed to showcase how F5 API solution able to bring value to your API's security and strategy. In order for API discovery to be meaningful, it needs dataset from API traffic. This dataset or API traffic will be fed into the F5 Advanced Machine Learning for ML modeling to identify API traffic patterns, characteristic, nature of those API, and so on. Hence, for this showcase, I continuously generate synthetic API traffic across this application for a period of time. I also intentionally exploited an unauthenticated public API and exfiltrate those data from internet. Let's see how F5 API discovery helps in identifying those attacks or data breach. As shown, I have API gateway for backend, money transfer, refer friends, as well as the Acadia frontend. Frontend facilitate north-south API where API call from internet to application. Let's explore at a high level on what actionable insight this API discovery provides. Let's start with backend API. First, let's understand there are three types of API. Inventory API is the API endpoint defined as per the user API definition. It is also known as API inventory. Discover API is the API endpoint which are discovered by F5 using AI/ML and are based on traffic to them. This may contain the inventory API and more. Shadow API is the API that are discovered but not in inventory. This is also known as unknown API or non-documented API. In this diagram, it's shown that there are two API versions for this backend API. V1 API and V2. V1 API are inventory and V2 are not and represented with discover or blue graph. All V2 API traffics being discovered and have traffic. All V2 API also shadow API or undocumented API. If I click on one of the learned API schema, let's say for example, order addresses, and look at the header, it's shown that this particular API is authenticated with authorization header. There are many ways an API can be authenticated, such as API key, basic authentication, jot token, and so on. This application leverages authorization header to authenticate API traffic. If I look at another one, change order by ID. It doesn't show any authorization header. What it means that for this API, authorization header not required. This potentially means that this API is unauthenticated and this is a non-compliance to security policy. This API could be the security weakest link. Now, if I move to another front-end API gateway, which exposes directly to internet. This diagram shown that get order by ID, get all orders, and get stocks are very popular API. It potentially consists of 80 to 90% of the total API call, especially for get order by ID. You can see that it requests about 49.6% of the total. This is 24.9, as well as the get stock, 24.8. This huge amount of traffic on this particular field API is abnormal. If I look into the headers for this particular API, there is no authorizations header, and this is an unauthenticated API. This may give you an actionable insight that someone's from internet accessing this unauthenticated API aggressively for the past hours or two. This could be an indication that some data exfiltration is happening. This should be investigated. If required, you can create rate limiting rules or protect the API by applying a protections rules onto this particular API. It is always a good API security practice to apply rate limits to your API. In addition to API discovery, all API endpoints are protected from OWASP top 10 or attacks similar like a web application. In summary, here are the key takeaways on how F5 API security and discovery can help. Governance of API. API governance is the practice of applying common rules and guardrails relating to API standard security policies to your API. It helps you to apply consistent security control to your API endpoint. F5 helps in identifying your API, whether it is known or unknown, private, public, or third-party or internal-only API. As seen in the demo, F5 provides enhanced visibility and analytics to your API ecosystem and health. It gives you actionable insight on how your API works, which most used, nature of those API, whether authenticated or unauthenticated, and so on. Finally, F5 helps in securing your API by applying rate limiting rules where required. Protect your API from common vulnerabilities and exploits, as well as seamlessly applying ACL or granular protections rules to those API. Feel free to reach out for further discussion. Thank you.